the final unit, Unit 7. Unit 7 is one of the biggest units, and what I've done here is I've combined some of the things you've learned in other units, but I put it all in this unit because it deals with policy, how we make laws and plans and rules, and how we make decisions that affect the things that happen in our community, in our state, in our country, and internationally. And so we're going to look at a wide variety of topics in this unit. So, are you ready? The first topic we're going to look at is a local issue, community development. Development is something you see all around you, especially living in Prince George's County, Maryland, where we have so many communities that are expanding. Community development can include building homes, businesses, roads, and stores. And development is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. If you look at this picture up here, when you develop, when you take a piece of land and you turn it into something like a road, you destroy a habitat, an ecosystem, trees, grass. It's very hard for those natural items to come back again. However, development can be good. You can build hospitals and schools and all sorts of services and shopping centers that people need and like and enjoy, that make life more fun. So as you can see good aspects to development, bad aspects of development. And something you might see on the HSAs, you might have to go into details and come up with your own reasons why development can be good as well as bad. In order for somebody to actually develop a piece of land, you have to get that land approved for development. And so you go to the zoning board. A zoning board decides how land is going to be used. Is it going to be used for commercial use, like a business, for housing, for a park, for a school, for a stadium? Who knows? And it's up to the zoning board to do this. The zoning board's responsibility is to control community growth, to make sure that we have enough infrastructure and enough schools and roads to have all the development a community wants. Infrastructure is a word I just used and is something you might see on the HSA. It's a great word to know. It comes in handy very much because we use these things all the time. Infrastructure items are the things that make development possible. So these are the things that we often forget about, but we can't live without, like electricity, sewers, roads, telephone, cable service, as well as schools and hospitals. These are all items that support development, that allow us to move to different places and to live our lives like the way we normally do. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at two different philosophies of development. The first one is the evil one called Sprawl. And in Sprawl, what you're doing is you're developing new suburbs by wasting open lands. An example of that might be going down the Rockville Pike or in Route 1 in Laurel. There's all sorts of shopping centers, and it's really, it's just a lot of pollution, a lot of congestion, not a very fun place to be. What happens in Sprawl is that you waste lots of green space. Instead of developing an existing community, in Sprawl you destroy forests and farms and areas that are natural to the environment by building suburbs and shopping centers. And by doing that, you force people to drive to get to places more instead of taking public transportation or walking, creating more pollution and more traffic. On the opposite spectrum, you have smart growth, and just by looking at the phrase smart growth, you know it's got to be good. Smart growth, the key to smart growth is this concept of revitalization or rejuvenation, and you probably are familiar with those words. Making something new again, making something better. So you take an area that already exists and you build upon it. You destroy old buildings, maybe put new buildings up. You renovate things. Take downtown Silver Spring. 10 years ago, nobody went to downtown Silver Spring. Now, It's a mecca for people who want to go to the movies, get something to eat, see a show. It's a fun place to be. Downtown Baltimore is very similar. The area in Hyattsville near the Prince George's Plaza, these are all areas that have been around for a while, and the government helped businesses make these areas better. By promoting smart growth, you prevent developers from destroying green space like forests and marshlands, and you use communities that already exist. Another key to smart growth is that oftentimes you have buildings that are built upwards instead of outwards. And what we mean by that is, take for example, let's say you have a 14-story building. Maybe on the first 2 floors you have a dry cleaners, a hair salon, and a restaurant. All of that is in the same building, and then the 12 or 10 stories above that building, you have apartments or condominiums or business offices. So instead of building outward, you build upward, getting the most out of a piece of land, being more efficient with your development. And that's the key to smart growth, being more efficient. What I want you to do in this slide is I want you to use the information we just went over on the previous slide and describe which set of pictures is smart growth, which set of pictures is sprawl. I'm not going to help you with this, but I'm pretty sure you can do this on your own. Take as much time as you need. You might have to go back to the previous slide to review the differences between smart growth and sprawl. This will help you remember these two concepts for the HSA. Here's some more practice with sprawl and smart growth, even though this question doesn't even mention the two phrases, but I'm sure you can figure out why these concepts are relevant. So the question reads, explain why members of the Maryland General Assembly, Maryland's legislative branch, might support funding to build a new football stadium in a densely or heavily populated area rather than in a lightly populated area. So use the information we reviewed on the previous 2 slides to come up with some reasons on why the government would support building the stadium in an area that has lots of people compared to an area that doesn't have lots of people. Take your time. If you can answer this question without hesitation and with lots of details, you've probably mastered the differences between sprawl and smart growth and are ready to do well on the HSA. What we're going to do in the next few slides is move away from state and local policy and look at federal domestic policy. And the most important type of federal policy you need to be familiar with are these examples of federal entitlements. The word entitle or entitlement means the government must provide it. It's something that is non-negotiable, something that the government must do. These are programs that help the elderly, ill, unemployed, people who need help, sometimes temporarily, sometimes more long-term. The reason why we have entitlements goes back to what you learned in U.S. history, the Great Depression of the 20s and 30s. During this time, at the peak, you had 25% of the entire population out of work. Private charities couldn't handle all the requests for assistance, and so Franklin Roosevelt is elected, and he comes up with this concept called the New Deal, where the government would create all these programs to help the needy. Many Democrats cheered this, gave the government more power, tried to help more people, while more conservative people felt that this created what we now have as a large and bloated government that takes way too much people's tax dollars. Very debatable if the New Deal programs work, but the impact of the New Deal is something we all feel today in programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, later instituted by Lyndon Johnson, based upon FDR's New Deal concept. There are 4 main entitlement programs that you will most definitely see on the HSA.
The first program you need to know is Social Security. And Social Security is what we all pay into when we earn our paycheck. Social Security, for most people, is just a monthly stipend. A stipend is like, a certain amount of money that is given to people, primarily people that are senior citizens. Sometimes if you're disabled, you can receive Social Security checks too. Medicare and Medicaid are very similar but very different, so pay attention to how they're different. Medicare, I always think of like care as if it's like long-term. Medicare pays the medical care for people who are elderly. All right, think of like how elderly people, they need a lot of care and love, so you've got to take care of them. Medicaid, I always think of like a Band-Aid, pays a portion of medical care for people who are low income. It's usually something that can be temporary because you're not always low income. If you're pregnant and you're having a hard time paying your bills, you can apply for Medicaid. And then finally, you have unemployment insurance. And if you were laid off or fired at your job, you can apply for unemployment insurance from your state, and they can provide you a small amount of money once a month. In order to get the money, however, you often have to prove that you're looking for a job, and unemployment insurance does not last forever.
We're going to look a little bit more closer now at the difference between Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare, if you look at the word Medicare, you see this word care. And care is something that you need long term. You need to be taken care of for many, many years. And elderly people need to be taken care of for many, many years. And so to help you remember that, I think of like a calendar, because a calendar is long term. Medicaid is different. Medicaid, the key word here is this word aid. And what I think of is like a Band-Aid. And a Band-Aid is something temporary, something that you might need only for a few days or a few weeks or a few months. So Medicare is long-term medical care for elderly. Medicaid is temporary medical care for people who are poor. Does that help? Here's a HSA question that sometimes comes up in a form similar to this. It says, which of these has contributed the most to the discussion of reforming means to change, Social Security? And we talked about this a little bit earlier. Do you remember what Social Security does? Social Security is an entitlement program that provides a monthly paycheck or stipend to people in their late 60s and above. And the problem right now is that the number of retired people is increasing rapidly, while the amount of money going into Social Security is not increasing rapidly. So you have all these old people who are going to need their money, and there's not enough young people working to provide this money for them. This isn't a problem that's going to happen anytime soon, but in the next 20, 30, 40 years, it will be a problem, especially when you, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old person, is thinking about retiring. We're going to move away from social issues and talk a little bit about the economy and economic policy. And before we get into this, we need to look at the three main goals of the United States government when it comes to the economy. The first one is promoting economic growth. And what that means is the United States makes sure and monitors whether or not businesses are making lots of products or selling their services. The more services and products being sold, the more likely growth is taking place. The second goal is promoting price stability, and the key here is this word stability, to make sure prices aren't changing very rapidly or radically. It's pretty nice knowing that when you go to bed at night that the price of gas or the price of milk is going to be relatively same when you wake up the next morning. And the third goal is to promote full employment, to make sure that everyone has a job that can work. Because the more people that are working, the more money that people make, and that the less the government has to spend on Medicare, Medicaid, and other social welfare programs. In the last slide, we went over the 3 different goals the U.S. government has when it's assessing the economy. And how that plays in now is we need to measure and be able to decide if we are meeting those 3 goals. And so I come up with this analogy here that you could make your own analogy if you could do it with weather or something else. But think about this. In sports, we have different statistics that tell us how well a player or team is performing. And based upon this data, these statistics, we as fans and sports analysts are able to judge if a team is doing really well or if a team is doing really bad. So take the Washington Capitals, our local hockey team. If the Capitals are scoring lots and lots of goals, and if our goalie is making lots and lots of saves, we can use those statistics to determine that the Washington Capitals must be doing really, really well. Well, in economics, we use statistics called the GDP, the CPI, and the unemployment rate. And we use these statistics to measure if our economy is doing really, really well, or if our economy is doing really, really bad. And based upon these statistics, this data, the government is able to either make fiscal policy or monetary policy to promote growth or to slow down growth based upon the statistics that we're measuring. And so in sports, we can assess if a team's doing really good based on statistics, and then we can decide if we're going to cheer for them or if we're not going to cheer for them. And in economics, we can assess if the economy is doing really well, and if the economy is not doing really well, we can take actions, make policy to help the economy or slow down the economy.
The first measuring tool that we see is something called a gross domestic product. And the key word here is this word product. Now, GDP measures all of the new goods and services that a country makes, either in a given month, a given quarter, or a given year. If you think about this logically, if your economy's doing great, you are making lots and lots of stuff. And so your GDP would be very high. If your economy is not doing very well, chances are your economy is not making many products, so your economy is not doing well. The better the GDP, the better the economy. And this is one of the 3 main tools we use to measure, to determine how we know if our economy is doing good or if our economy is doing bad.
The Consumer Price Index is the next tool we're going to look at and as we study the economy. The Consumer Price Index measures how much money people spend on consumer goods. And the key to knowing what the CPI does is knowing the word price. As you know, price is the cost of a good or service. The CPI is important because it measures how much money we spend on housing, groceries, gasoline, and energy, as well as medical costs. What the CPI tells us is if inflation is occurring or not occurring. Inflation is the natural increase in the price of goods. So if you think about a balloon and you inflate the balloon, you are making the balloon bigger. You're increasing the size of the balloon. Well, that's what inflation is. So if you pay $2 for 1 gallon of gas last year and you're paying $4 for that same gallon of gas this year, then the price of gasoline has inflated. You're spending more money to get the same amount of goods. Does that sound good to you?
In this slide, we see how the concept of inflation works. Back in 2000, you were making $5.80, while the movie ticket, the VHS movie, and the CD costed $8, $10, $12 respectively. Fast forward 9 years later, you're still making $5.80, and look at what happens to the price of all of these goods. The price goes up. Therefore, the question here asks, did you have to spend more or less over time to get the same goods? And the answer is, well, yeah, you had to spend more to get the same amount of goods. Now, the most important question is number 2. Did the dollar gain or lose power over time? And because you had to spend more to get the same amount of items, the value of that dollar actually decreased. When you have to spend more money to chase fewer goods, then the power of that currency goes down.
The unemployment rate is a number that measures who is out of work, but who is actively searching for a job and cannot find one. It does not measure people who have given up their search for work. The unemployment rate in 2009 has been very high. Do you know why it's been very high? What types of things could the government do to make sure that more and more people are employed? Based on the different economic measuring tools that exist, the government makes policy actions to affect the economy. There are 2 types of policy that you need to know for the HSA. The first type of policy is called fiscal policy, and the second one is called monetary policy. Let's start with fiscal policy first. In fiscal policy, the government affects the economy through taxing and spending. By taxing, the government collects money, and then the government spends that money through a budget. The president and Congress control taxing and spending, and the 2 tools they can use, they can either increase or decrease taxes, or they can increase government spending or decrease government spending. And you'll notice how some of these arrows are underlined. We're going to talk more about that on the next slide. A couple keywords to help you remember fiscal policy is the phrase taxing and spending, or the word budget, because that's what fiscal policy is all about. Now, on the opposite side there, you see monetary policy. And the key to monetary policy is knowing that monetary policy deals with money and the money supply. And if you look at the word monetary, it's very similar to the word money. Unlike fiscal policy, the Fed, or the Federal Reserve, controls monetary policy. And the most important tool the Fed has is via changing interest rates, or sometimes it's referred to as the federal funds rate. And the lower or higher the interest rates, the easier or more challenging it is to borrow money. If you see the words money supply, loans, mortgages, that all deals with monetary policy. We're going to take this slide and go a little bit deeper in just a few minutes. The main fiscal policy remedies you need to be familiar with when it comes to the HSA are when to raise or decrease taxes, as well as when to raise or decrease government spending. Now, let's suppose we are in an economic recession and the government wants to make it much, much easier for people to get money. Think for a second. What would you recommend the government do to make it easier for people to have money? Well, the first thing that the government might want to do, and you might want to recommend, is to lower taxes. Because if you lower taxes, people will have more money to spend. And if people have more money to spend, people can buy things, and if stores are selling things, stores can hire people, and if stores hire people, then those people who are hired can go buy things, and the economy magically gets better, supposedly. Next, the government might increase its spending. By increasing government spending, the government can build more roads, invest in new infrastructure, provide more unemployment benefits in order to help people who are being negatively affected by the recession. And then finally, we will look at monetary policy. And remember, monetary policy deals with controlling the nation's money supply. Because if you have too much money in circulation, then the value of that dollar or currency goes down. And the best and most powerful tool that the Federal Reserve, that's the government agency that controls monetary policy, the biggest tool the Federal Reserve has, or the Fed has, is controlling interest rates. Remember interest rates. Interest rates. Well, when you borrow money from a bank, the bank charges you a fee, and the fee to borrow money is called an interest rate. So if you're borrowing money, would you prefer to have a really high interest rate or a really low interest rate? Well, if you're poor like me, you would want a really low interest rate because that means you have to pay back much less money. So if we were in a recession, the Federal Reserve would lower interest rates. I highly recommend you rewatch this session again to understand and be able to explain what the government would do if the economy was in a recession. This is a practice HSA question regards to what we were learning about before. And the question reads, which of these actions would the Federal Reserve most likely do or take to end a recession? And so the key here is Federal Reserve. That's the noun. That's who's making the choice, the decision. And then the other word here you need to know is recession. So how are they going to end a recession? Well, we talked about how the Federal Reserve primarily uses interest rates. And we also talked about how when we're in a recession, people aren't spending lots of money, businesses aren't making lots of money, therefore people are getting fired and laid off. If the government reduces
What is globalization? Well, globalization is a fairly new trend that's happened over the last 50 years in the world. And if you look at the word itself, you can tell that it's about the earth as a whole. And the definition is that countries are now very highly connected. Economically, culturally, politically, and socially. They are connected in many, many ways. Why is this? Well, that is because of new communication and transportation systems. The biggest of all of these is the internet. The internet allows people from all over the world to stay connected at all times. The trend that you need to pay attention to, and this is a big vocab word that appears in the HSA, is the world is now becoming more interdependent, which means that each country now depends on others. No longer can a country get everything it needs culturally, politically, socially without being connected to another country. An example of this is the United States is very dependent on Mexico and Canada because they are so close to us that we trade a lot with them. Another one is that the European Union, many countries in Europe are now very, very connected because of their communication and transportation systems. So remember, when you see globalization on the HSA, remember that it's about countries being highly connected and interdependent. These next few slides are about international organizations. And these are organizations that affect the entire world at once. The first one of these is the Red Cross. And I'm sure you've heard of this before. In high school, the Red Cross comes and lets you donate blood. But internationally, it provides humanitarian assistance during wars, health emergencies, or natural disasters. Each one of these organizations is important because they have pros and cons. The controversy on the Red Cross is it can't save everyone all the time. The next international organization that's very important, comes up on the HSA almost every single year, is the United Nations. And again, looking at the name, we know that it's talking about a globalized organization. It is a group of over 180 countries that meets to try and find peaceful solutions to the world's problems. Whether they're wars or natural disasters, the UN tries to get all the nations of the world together to try to find a peaceful solution to these problems. Again, like the Red Cross, there's always a controversy. Countries are wary of handing control of their country to the UN. They worry about losing their autonomy, which is self-rule. Many times countries don't like the fact that an outside organization is telling them what to do with their government and their lives. So always remember, there's a pro and a con to every single organization. The next two international organizations have to do with the economy. And the first is the World Bank. Well, what is this? If you look at the word itself, it's a bank for the rest of the world. It gives out loans, advice, or training to developing nations to eliminate poverty. Like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, hopes to prevent worldwide money problems by giving loans to developing countries. So they both give loans to countries that are in need of money. Now, why is this controversial? Well, as you heard me say, they're not giving this money away, it's a loan. So developing countries have to pay back this money that they're given. Oftentimes, they rack up so much debt that it's almost impossible for them to pay back. So while it does have its benefits, it's giving loans and money to help countries build infrastructure, schools, highways, police, humanitarian aid. They eventually have to pay this money back, and sometimes they can't. Let's do a practice question with the information that we've learned so far. Which of these is an action the International Monetary Fund takes to help developing nations? Is it A, stabilizing currencies, B, supplying medical care, C, resolving border disputes, or D, providing medical technology? Take 1 minute and think about the answer. If you guessed A, stabilizing currencies, then you are correct. Why is this so? Well, the International Monetary Fund, if you remember, tries to fix money problems. And A, stabilizing currency, is the only answer that has to do with money. When you get a question on the HSA, always think to yourself, what is the best answer? Although B and D both involve money, A is the only answer that the International Monetary Fund would be directly connected to. So always remember when you're taking the HSA to think about what's the best answer, because the HSA will try to trick you sometimes, but always think about what is the best answer. This next international organization has to do with the military and defense, and it's called the North Atlantic Treaty Treaty Organization. Or, if you look at the acronym, NATO. Well, what is this? It has 26 members from North America and Europe, and it's a defense alliance, which means it protects each member of NATO. An attack against one member of NATO is an attack against all members of NATO. Well, again, each organization has some controversy. The controversy with NATO is that it was created to defend against communist USSR during the Cold War. And now that the Cold War is over and the USSR doesn't exist anymore, some people feel that NATO does not need to exist. So always remember, there's a pro and a con to each organization. This next international organization is known as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And it has 3 members: the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And this involves an economic alliance between these 3 countries. What it does is creates free trade for members of NAFTA. There are little or no tariffs or taxes on imported and exported goods and services. This means that it's very cheap to buy things or sell things between Mexico, United States, and Canada. Again, there's always a controversy. Many agriculture and manufacturing jobs went to Mexico because of lower labor costs. Because there's such little taxes, United States companies want to make things as cheap as possible. So they moved a lot of jobs out of the United States and into Mexico because labor is cheaper.